My name is Jonathan Amisi. I'm a PhD student at Monash University, and the title of my talk is Capolite, a mineral redox buffer in ore forming processes, application for metal mobility in IOCG systems. Before going into the content of the talk itself, I'll give a quick overview of the content. So first, I'll give an introduction and significance of research. Then I will talk briefly about scapolite occurrence and albitization of scapolite. I'll go through research question, I'll present the methods, present some results, and the implication of the results. Scapolite occurrence and regionally albitized scapolite have been described in several regions, whether it is in Australia or in Europe or South America. One thing that all these regions share in common is that they do host IOCG or skarn deposits. Now, before I go further, I'll give you a bit more information about what scapolite is. So scapolite is a solid solution between three end members, and what they have as a particularity is that each of them has a site in their crystal structure that hosts a volatile component. It's either chlorine, CO2, or sulfur, and on the right hand side you can see how they look like in end specimen. Now this leads us to the risk questions, the first one being that given that scapolites contain sulfur and chlorine, and both being the most important ligand for dissolution and metal transport in ore deposits, does albitization of scapolite plays a role in ore forming processes in our CG systems? And second, can scapolite host sulfur in various oxidation state? And if yes, can it be used to trace redox processes in ore forming fluid? So when scapolites undergo metamorphic devolatilization and eventually react with highly saline fluids, scapolite gets albitized. And the reaction for each end members, mariolite, meionite, and sylviolite, is that it does release the volatile component to the fluid. In the case of mariolite, it's chlorine. For meionite, it's chlorine and CO2, and for sylviolite, it is chlorine and SO4. Now, please keep in mind those reactions as I'll be presenting results from the next slides. But before, I'll just quickly go through the method. So we've done some fieldwork and collected some samples. We've done some SEM and probe analysis to characterize the sulfur and chlorine concentration in the scapolite. We've done some synchrotron to investigate sulfur and chlorine distribution in scapolite and investigate the sulfur species present in scapolite and their oxidation stage. And we've done some geochemical simulation to investigate metal mobility that will be induced by a fluid formed by breakdown of scapolite during metamorphic devolatilization. This is one of the samples for these studies. If you look at the sodium map, so this is a microprobe map. If you look at sodium, you can clearly identify the scapolite there, which is in green, and then there is albite above, and in between there's some calcite. So you can clearly see that the scapolite at the bottom in green is slightly getting reddish in the structural lineation, and that's basically a scapolite grain that is being albitized. Now, if you look at the variation in composition in terms of volatile in the sample sets that we have defined three different groups. So the first group are the samples that are sulfur-free and either rich in chlorine or CO2. A second group that is sulfur-poor but high chlorine. And then a third group that is low sulfur and contains a fair amount of chlorine and CO2. And keep in mind those three groups, as we'll be getting back to that later on when I'll be presenting the synchrotron result. So this is the Zane result for one of the samples for this study. As you can see, the high peak there is the S6+, which is an oxidized species, and next to it 4+, which is also oxidized. And as you go on the left-hand side, then you've got the polysulfide and other reduced sulfur species. So this shows that we do have in scapolites presence of both oxidized and reduced sulfur. Overall, so these are the different samples that we have analyzed with synchrotron. Again, you can see that the different samples are showing different spectrum and different spike. Of course, the most prominent is the 6+, the oxidized that we see there in the middle, and then the +4. But we do also have a fair amount of samples that contain polysulfide and other reduced species. So we've used the Xane analysis first to identify the different sulfur species in scapolite, but also to make an estimate of the different species. The diagram on the screen show on the y-axis ratio between sulfur and chlorine, and on the x-axis ratio between oxidized sulfur and reduced sulfur, and the size of the triangle is the sulfur concentration. Similarly to the ternary diagrams showed previously, there are three distinct groups of scapolites. The first group is high sulfur scapolite, which is typically oxidized. The second group is medium sulfur and high chlorine, typically enriched in oxidized sulfur. And the third group is the sulfur poor and high chlorine content, which is typically enriched in reduced sulfur. The particularity here is that the enriched in reduced sulfur scapolites are all hosted in graphitic shale, and the calc silicates host mostly scapolite that are enriched in oxidized sulfur, which could lead to think that there could be two distinct sources. Now, to investigate the ability of a fluid formed by scapolite breakdown during metamorphic devolatilization, we have used in our model a scapolite-bearing rock that undergoes metamorphic devolatilization at 550 degrees, 5 kilobars. We have used a salinity reacting with the rock between 0 to 5.5 molar, pH buffered by quartz, K-feldspar, and muscovite, and near neutral condition between 4.5 and 5. So if we look at, for example, gold, we can see that at moderate to high salinity and reduced conditions, gold is very soluble. But if we look at copper, for example, on the right-hand side, it doesn't show that much dependence to redox in low salinity fluids, but redox becomes very important in highly saline fluid. If we take again the example for gold, we can see that the concentration increase quite dramatically if we take the diagonal from the reduced conditions to oxidized condition towards high salinity fluid. Now, two other important base metal in our CJ system. So if you look at zinc, for example, it only show dependence to salinity and not much dependence to redox state. But if we look at lead, for example, it does show dependency to redox regardless of the salinity. Iron seems to be highly dependent to salinity. So if we go from the left-hand side to the right-hand side, we can see also that the concentration of iron increased dramatically. And of course, the chlorine species are the most dominant species in this fluid. So now what can we conclude? So first, scapolite contains substantial amounts of sulfur and chlorine, and for this study up to 1.3 for sulfur and 3.6 for chlorine. Sulfur in scapolite is present in both reduced and oxidized form. Third, sulfur species and chlorine content does affect the fluid chemistry and buffers the redox condition during ore forming processes in our series systems. And The fluid generated by scapolite devolatilization or affected by scapolite crystallization can form chemically complex brine capable of mobilizing various metallic elements. And the metal association basically depends on whether the fluid is dominantly reduced or oxidized. Thank you for listening.